Hi, Lark Galley here, and I wanted to share some thoughts I had about why we may or may not receive manifestations from a deceased loved one. What prompted this was a conversation I had with a friend who told me that since her husband's passing 10 years ago, she has never experienced any kind of connection with him since, maybe physical or feeling wise or thoughts, etc. And she just kind of was feeling a little bit bereft and possibly left out from hearing about experiences other people have had. um, Sharing experience that my mom had when my stepfather passed away about 15 years ago. She would find pennies all over the place, and that would trigger her connection with her deceased spouse and kind of create that connection like, oh, Rex is here. Rex is thinking about me, or just a reminder of that relationship. And that was the connection that she had. And so sometimes we can create these correct connections where we can feel our loved one close to us, and these can be on different levels. And so I want to share my experience that I've had in creating the connection that I have with my deceased son. So, first of all, I want to point out that my father died by suicide 5 years before my son died. And my father and I weren't especially close. There had been some frustrations early on uh, in our relationship, as a parent-child relationship. And so we had done pretty well in the latter years, but not super close connection. And so when he passed away, while I was grieving and while it impacted me a lot deeper than I thought, I didn't have any of these connections with him, emotional, spiritual, etc., until after my son died, and then I started reaching out. And so that's something I want to point out, is that you need to be open to receiving this and be aware and actually want to receive some of these connections with your deceased loved ones. My sister, on the other hand, who was very close with my father and had that emotional connection, she had dreams about him and she felt his presence. And so that's something that I want to point out. Now, how did I experience the connection with my son after he was deceased? First of all, it came through other people. And in the first week since his passing, I had 3 different people come up to me and say, I have a message for you from your son. And I said, okay, I'm open to receiving this message. I want to hear it. And all 3 of them started out by saying, tell my mom that I love her. Now, this was a very comforting message to me because of a couple things. Number one, my son and I had a difficult relationship before he passed, and I was not feeling that he loved me when he passed away. And so to hear these comforting words, it felt very good. The other thing that I thought, and I talked to a friend about this, I said, why did I have to get these messages through other people? Why couldn't my son have just given me this message myself? And she said something that was very impactful for me. She said, because you probably would not have believed it. You would have felt that you made it up. But by having 3 different people come to me, give me the same message, then I could know that this was actually something that my son was trying to communicate with me. So that was one way. The other way is through nature, through a natural connection that might happen. When my mother-in-law died years ago, at the funeral, we noticed this fire rainbow, which means that there had been no rain. It was just some moisture in the air. And there were 2 rainbows side by side, 2 completely separate rainbows. And my son, who was maybe about 12 at the time, said, oh, look, there's a fire rainbow. And he pointed up to it, and our whole family looked up at it. And that created this connection with maybe a loved one passing and the rainbow. And immediately I began to see rainbows in connection with my son. The first one came on the night of his viewing, the day before his funeral. And as I was walking into the funeral home, arriving early, arrived by myself, the rest of the family came in a separate car. I looked out over the valley towards the mountains, and I could see this beautiful rainbow. And I knew that my son was trying to connect with me. Now, fast forward 6 months later, where I had spent 3 days at a bereaved mother's retreat, and I'm driving home, and there in the mountains is the most vivid, colorful, large rainbow. It was the biggest rainbow I had ever seen. And it was as if my son was reaching out to me and embracing me and saying, I know what you've been going through this weekend. Thank you for remembering me, and I'm remembering you, and we have this beautiful connection. And that was wonderful. And I so appreciated that. And then as we're going forward, in my connection with my son, I have heard his voice different times. A lot of times when I'm either very distraught or distressed, or maybe needing some extra comfort, and I have felt him and heard his voice talking to me in my head, and that was to me personally. Uh, there was a time when I was just feeling so upset and so troubled, and he came to me and he just said, Mom, that's not the way it is. It's okay. It's okay. And I just felt so much peace and comfort. And then in addition, I've had other people give me messages from him that I have shared before. So not only other people giving me messages, but also me hearing his voice. And then the most recent one was an actual physical manifestation where I saw a physical object move. No one else was in the room, and there was no way that this object could have moved unless someone else were there, meaning my son. And yes, it did freak me out a little bit. And it's kind of funny because, even if we believe in our loved ones still existing, it's one thing to feel them. It's maybe one thing to hear their voice in our heads. It's quite a different thing to actually see a physical object moving before your eyes. And so I thanked him for showing me that he was there. And then I had to let him know, hey, you're freaking me out a little bit. Can you let's just leave it at that. But it was kind of funny. You never quite know how you're going to react. But I think the important things here is that I actually wanted to connect with my son. I was actively seeking for ways to connect. I was being open and willing to accept these connections that he might give to me. My husband has seen an eagle on the day of our son's funeral. He drove home, and there was an eagle perched on the top of our house, and that was kind of a symbol for our son as well. And this was very odd. We lived at the time in a suburban area, but we had never ever seen an eagle there, and we had lived in that area for 20 years. And so he just felt that connection. Now, since then, my husband hasn't seen or heard or created any of those connections with our son, and I think that he's been very depressed and just not in an emotional or a mental state to actively seek for and be open to those connections. And so it's something I want to point out is that if you're completely depressed and inside yourself, you probably aren't going to see these beautiful connections. But if you are willing to believe that your deceased loved one can manifest to you, and that you're open to the signs and these connections with my mother, it was the penny and her husband, and then for me it was the rainbows, and then just hearing my son and feeling him in time of need. And so I hope this brings you comfort and encouraging you to actively seek to connect with those you love.